Chapter 60. Just as the world had been drying out nicely and the drive becoming enjoyable, in Newt's view, it suddenly got very wet again. 2 days before they hit the Red River, low black clouds boiled out of the northwest like smoke off grease. It was spring-like and fair in the morning, but before it even was afternoon, the world turned to water. It rained so hard for 2 hours that it was difficult even to see the cattle. Newt moped along on mouse, feeling chilled and depressed. By this time, they were on a rolling plain bare of trees. There was nothing to get under except the sky. They made a wet camp, and Campo poured hot coffee down them by the gallon, but it still promised to be a miserable night. Poe and Dietz, the acknowledged experts on weather, discussed the situation and admitted they didn't know when it might stop raining. "It probably won't rain a week," Campo said, which cheered nobody up. "Darn, better not rain no week," Jasper said. "Them rivers be like oceans." That night they all herded, not because the cattle were particularly restless, but because it was drier on a horse than on the sopping ground. Newt began to think it had been a mistake to leave Lonesome Dub if it was going to be so wet. He remembered how dry and clear the days had been there. He and Mouse stumbled through the night somehow, though before morning he was so tired he had lost all interest in living. The next day was no better. The skies were like iron, and Mr. Gus wasn't back. He'd been gone a long time, it seemed, and so had Lorena. Dish Boggett grew increasingly worried and took to confiding in Newt now and then. Newt respected his feelings, whereas the other hands were distinctly callous when it came to Dish's feelings. "Because of Jake, we lost them both, I guess," Dish said. "Jake is a goddamn bastard." It was painful to Newt to have to think of Jake that way. He still remembered how Jake had played with him when he was a little child, and that Jake had made his mother get a lively, merry look in her eyes. All the years Jake had been gone, Newt had remembered him fondly and suspected that if he ever did come back, he would be a hero. But it had to be admitted that Jake's behavior since his return had not been heroic at all. It bordered on the cowardly, particularly his casual return to card playing once Lorena had been stolen. "If she's alive and Gus gets her back, I still aim to marry her," Dish said as rain poured off his hat in streams. "Darn, we should be herding fish," he said a little later, holding the point nonetheless, though he had hardly felt like it. If Lorena was indeed dead, he meant to stay clear of other women and grieve for her for a lifetime. It was still raining when they came to the low banks of the Red River. The river was up somewhat, but it was still not a very wide channel or a very deep one. What worried Call was the approach to it, over 100 yards of wet, rusty-colored sand. The Red was famous for quicksands. Dietz sat with him, looking at the river thoughtfully. It had long represented the northern boundary of their activity. The land beyond the rusty sands was new to them. "You think we ought to wait and let it go down?" Call asked. "It ain't going down," Dietz pointed out. "It's still raining." Dish came over to watch as Dietz probed for a crossing, several times checking his horse and moving to the side to seek firmer footing. "I guess this will spoil Jasper's digestion," he said, for Jasper's sensitivity on the subject of rivers was becoming more pronounced. "We bogged 60 head of Mr. Pierce's cattle in this very river, although that was over toward the Arkansas. I must have had 100 pounds of mud on my clothes before we got 'em out." Dietz put his horse into the surging water and was soon across the channel, but had to pick his way across another long expanse of sand before he was safely on the northern bank. Evidently he didn't like the crossing because he waved the others back with his hat and loped away downriver. He was soon out of sight in the rain, but came back in an hour with news of a far better crossing downstream. By then the whole crew was nervous, for the Red was legendary for drowning cowboys, and the fact that they had nothing to do but sit and drip increased general anxiety. But their fears were unfounded. The rain slowed, and the sun broke through as they were easing the cattle across the mud flats toward the brownish water. Dietz had found a gravel bar that made the entrance to the river almost as good as a road. Old Dog led the herd right in, and was soon across and grazing on the long, wet grass of the Oklahoma Territory. 5 or 6 of the weaker cows bogged as they were coming out, but they were soon extracted. Dish and Soapy took off their clothes and waded in the mud and got ropes on the cows, and Bert Borum pulled them out. The sight of the sun put the men in high spirits. Heading they crossed the Red River and lived to tell about it. That night the Irishmen sang for hours, and a few of the cowboys joined in. They had gradually learned a few of the Irish songs. Sometimes Campo sang in Spanish. He had a low, throaty voice that always seemed like it was about to die for lack of breath. The songs bothered some of the men. They were so sad. "Poe, you're a jolly fella. How come you only sing about death?" Soupy asked. Poe had a little rattle made from a gourd, and he shook it when he sang. The rattle plus his low, throaty voice made a curious effect. The sounds could make the hairs stand upon P.I.'s neck. "That's right, Poe. You do sing sad for a happy man," P.I. observed once as the old man shook his gourd. "I don't sing about myself," Campo said. "I sing about life. I am happy, but life is sad. Songs don't belong to me." "Well, you sing them. Why don't they belong to you?" P asked. "They belong to those who hear them," Poe said. He'd given Dietz one of the little women figures he whittled. Dietz was very proud of it and kept it in the pocket of his old chaps. "Don't give none of them to me," P.I. said. "They're too sad. I'll get them nervous dreams." "If you hear them, they belong to you," Poe said. It was hard to see his eyes. They were deep set anyway, and he seldom took his big-brimmed hat off. "I wish we had a fiddle," Needle said. "If we had a fiddle, we could dance." "Dance with who?" Bert asked. "I don't see no ladies." "Dance with ourselves," Needle said. But they didn't have a fiddle. Just Campo shaking his rattle and the Irishman singing of girls. Even on a nice clear night, the sad singing and the knowledge that there were no ladies was enough to make the men feel low. They ended up talking of their sisters, those that had them most nights. Call heard little of the talk or the singing, for he continued to make his camp apart. He thought it best. If the herd ran, he'd be in a better position to head it. Gus's absence depressed him. It could only mean that something had gone wrong and they might never find out what. One night, cleaning his rifle, he was startled by the sound of his own voice. He'd never been one to talk to himself, but as he cleaned the gun, he'd been having in his head the conversation with Gus that there had not been time to have gone before Gus left. "I wish you'd have killed the man when you had a chance," he said. "I wish you'd never encouraged Jake to bring that girl." The words had just popped out. He was doubly glad he was alone, for if the men had heard them, they would have thought him daft. But no one heard him except the hell bitch who grazed at the end of the long rope. Every night he slipped one end of the rope beneath his belt and then looped it around his wrist so that there could be no chance of her taking fright and suddenly jerking loose from him. Call had become so sensitive to her movements that if she even raised her head to sniff the air, he would wake up. Usually it was no more than a deer or passing wolf, but the mare noticed. Call rested better, knowing she would watch.